Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So this chapter that started Zot Chukat HaPesach, this chapter that talks about the statutes or the laws regarding Pesach, I neglected to say that this particular chapter has to do, or this section has to do with something that we call Pesach Ledorot. So we make a distinction between Pesach de Mitzrayim, that is to say, the Pesach that was celebrated in the land of Egypt on the eve of their departure, and the laws associated with that particular celebration, and all the subsequent celebrations of Pesach that we are commanded to observe. That is part of what we're reading here, that has to do with future celebrations of Pesach, and that's Pesach Ledorot. And I did not catch that when I started working with you yesterday on this particular material, and I realized how important it was for you to know that, to be aware that our tradition looks at it in that particular way and designates it in this kind of way. So we're still finishing up here this particular little section that has to do with some of the laws regarding Pesach Ledorot. So here we are. Cool.
Did you say the blessing?
I'm not sure.
I don't
I
think
thought
so.
I did right away,
Oh,
but
maybe you did.
I'm not sure. But yeah, let's assume that I did. Cool. I'll be able to check later, that's for sure.
I don't know.
Kol adat Yisrael ya'asu oto. The entire congregation, the entire community of Israel shall perform it, shall do it. In other words, every single Jew, every single Israelite is supposed to participate in this Pesach. And of course, when the temple existed, the Pesach, and we can read about this in Tractate Pesachim, people would bring the lamb that they were going to have as their Pesach offering to the temple and then take it back to their homes where they would eat it that night with their families and the people who were subscribed to that particular lamb. And that was the way in which Pesach was observed when the temple still existed. Of course, we have the shank bone that symbolizes that Pesach lamb. We also understand the matzah in some ways to represent the Pesach as well. So, Kol Adat Yisrael Yasu Oto, right? The entire community of Israel will perform it. Lama Ne'emar. So the question becomes, why is this stated? Why is this? Why do we read this? Lefi shehu omer bePesach Mitzrayim, because when it comes to accounting for the laws of the Pesach, that original Pesach in the land of Israel, it says there, Se lebeit avot. It says that, in other words, that the lamb or the kid, should be assigned to families, right? The ancestral house of each family, right? Shenimnu alav lemishpachot. In other words, they were subscribed to the lamb according to families. So the question is, in other words, you couldn't invite someone outside your family to, in fact, consume that Pesach. That isn't the way it worked for Pesach de Mitzrayim. So the question is, well, what about future Pesachim? Does that mean also it has to just be members of the family who can subscribe to the Pesach, to the Paschal Lamb? Yachol af Pesach Dorot Kain, right? Maybe in future Pesachim, that also is the rule. Talmud Lomar, and for that reason, Scripture teaches, Kol Adat Yisrael Ya'asuto. The entire community of Israel shall perform it. Meaning that this verse comes to tell you that for in the future, you don't have to just be a member of the family in order to join other families regarding the consumption of the Pesach. That future Seders could be held with people outside the family. And that is the point of this particular verse here. V'chi yagur itcha ger. what happens if a stranger or this is talking about someone here who's understood as a convert. The rabbis understand this term ger in the Torah to mean someone who converts to Judaism. And should a convert live with you, v'asa Pesach ladonai, he should also perform this Pesach to the Lord. He lo, okay, he should be circumcised, kol zachar, every male, v'az yikrav la'asoto, and then he can slaughter or offer up the Pesach to perform it. V'haya ke'ezrach haaretz, and he should be like a citizen of the land. Like, in other words, he should be treated like or perform or do just like the other members of the Jewish people. V'chol arel lo yochal bo. However, anyone who is uncircumcised should not consume it, is not permitted to consume the Pesach. You have to be circumcised. Here we go. V'asa Pesach. So we're talking about someone who converts to Judaism, and we're told here he has to perform the ritual of the Pesach. Yes, Judith.
I mean, are we talking about a Seder?
Yes.
Or then non-Jews shouldn't come to Seders?
Well, here's the story. Because we don't eat the Paschal lamb, okay, anymore, they certainly can come and be invited, all right? The other thing is that I would say that even in a situation where the Paschal lamb was being consumed and you wanted to invite a non-Jew to your Seder, and I'm not giving you an official halachic opinion here, it's speculation on my part, that if you were to say to the person, please understand that our eating rather the lamb, okay, is a very specific and sacred ritual, and you have to be a member of the Jewish people to do it and be circumcised. But we want you to feel invited, and we want you to feel that you can come and be with us and participate, but you'd have to handle it in a way that was diplomatic and wasn't, rude to someone. There are certain things, I mean, obviously there are times when we have non-Jewish people participating in Jewish rituals. And I want to be sensitive to the fact. So, for example, when I do a funeral and there may be a non-Jew who's participating there, I like to explain to them that this is a Jewish ritual and they should not feel compelled to do it. And also, I wouldn't want to do something that might go against their own particular, traditions and religious practices. So it's a question of being respectful. So that's the way I'd like to answer the question, to say that there's nothing to say you can't invite a non-Jewish person to your Seder. It's just that in looking at this literally, they should not be eating a sacrifice.
But we don't eat a sacrifice.
That's my point. So since we don't anymore, when the temple existed and we actually consumed the Pesach lamb, then this would absolutely apply. But we don't at this particular point. Right. So there's really nothing they can't participate in, I imagine. I mean, one might perhaps say that eating the matzah, but it's not. Eating the matzah does not have the same sanctity that eating the Pesach did. The Pesach was kodshim. Kodshim kalim is what they'd be called. In other words, sanctified food that is a light sanctified food. It doesn't have a supreme level of holiness to it. But nevertheless, it's still sanctified, and for that reason, it has to be treated differently. By the way, there's also a law that said that when you ate from the Pesach, you were supposed to already be full. You weren't supposed to get personal pleasure out of eating the Paschal lamb, because you were doing it strictly as an act of a mitzvah to satisfy the commandments regarding the Pesach. Did you want to follow up, Judith, with anything on that? Okay. All right. So we're saying that if this person becomes a member of the Jewish people, va'asa Pesach, it says at this point, assuming he's circumcised, right, he should also perform the Pesach. Yachol hamit kayer. So we might understand this, right? Uh, just if all it said was the first part of the sentence, we might understand that anyone who converts, Ya'aseh Pesach miyad, the moment they had, because it just says, if he converts, he should perform the Pesach. So we might think that he's supposed to do it the moment he converts, like the day after. Then he does the Pesach. Talmud Lomar. And for this reason, the Torah teaches, let me find it here, right? Vahia kezrach haaretz. That's why it adds the statement, he should be like a citizen of the land. So just ma izrach ba'asar, just as a regular Jew has to consume the Pesach the evening of the 14th, going into the 15th, right? That's when they do it. Af ger ba'arba'asar. So it's teaching you that even if he converts 6 months before Pesach, he still has to wait until the 14th of Nisan and the night of the 14th of Nisan in order to perform the Pesach and to eat the Pesach. So it goes on to say v'chol arel, and it says that every uncircumcised person, lo yochal bo, should not eat it. So even if you're Jewish, right? Even if you're an Israelite, you still, if you were not circumcised, you were not permitted to eat the Pesach. And again, this is all part of an understanding of the sanctity of this particular moment. And part of it, what makes it special and sanctified, are the rules that go along with the actual consumption of it and the details. So why is this mentioned? Because it's already been mentioned about how if someone has a slave and or a hireling or somebody like that, and they're not, if they have a slave, they're supposed to make sure they're circumcised and they can then eat the Pesach. This was in a previous lesson, right? So why is it repeating this? Lahavi et shemetu achiv mechamat milah. This is to include, right, this particular law that says they cannot eat from the Pesach is to include someone whose brothers died on account of circumcision. And she'eno mumar, in other words, it's not that he was an apostate, or Lot. In other words, he wasn't a person who said, "No, I'm not going to be circumcised." A person born Jewish and refuses to become circumcised, because that would be included in a previous passage that said, "Kol ben nechar." And Rashi understood that term to mean someone who refuses to perform mitzvot. And this particular person that he's referring to here and saying that this particular law is not talking about such a person. It's not talking about someone who refuses to be circumcised. It's talking about a person who wasn't circumcised because of the force of circumstances. Ve'eno nilmad mi ben nechar, right? It is this particular situation cannot be learned from that phrase ben nechar, lo yochal bo, to say that that person cannot eat it. So it's saying that unfortunately, even though this person isn't circumcised because his brothers died as a result of circumcision, right? But he is not circumcised, he's still not allowed to eat from the Pesach. And I know that it sounds arbitrary, and it is, but it has to do with trying to be really respectful in terms of one's relationship to one's divine ruler, and to understand there are situations where these things are given to us and we're doing them because God commanded us to do them. Essentially, that's the reason for doing them. And in this particular circumstance, this particular mitzvah is not one that we can perform if this has happened and we're uncircumcised. Taking a step back, it is obviously clarifying to a great extent the importance and the connection between circumcision and the ability to perform an offering. And part of the reason for that, and it goes all the way back to the initial statement of circumcision, which is one of the few commandments given in the book of Genesis, that right before he gives the command to Abraham to circumcise himself and his family, the males in his family, he says, "Be perfect." And it's understood that the foreskin is a imperfection. It's an interesting concept. It's saying that as human beings, we have a responsibility to perfect ourselves even on a physical kind of level. And so the circumcision, by the way, there are huge implications regarding immortality, believe it or not, and other kinds of things. And when we are performing an act of such a level of holiness, we are like priests. And priests had to be very, very careful and very, very thoughtful about every act, very mindful about all the acts they performed. And in a way that's reminiscent of this in the practice of the tomb at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Washington and Arlington, where every detail of what the soldiers do who stand guard over that tomb have to perform. It is clearly a universal understanding that working in such detail is an act of deep, deep respect. And so I'm only touching the surface of it, but clearly we see here the fact that even if a person may have wanted to be circumcised, willing to be circumcised, willing to perform the mitzvah, nevertheless they cannot eat from the Pesach offering, but understanding that in that particular case, in a way, that we should see it as being excused from it. And like now, we can't do it because we don't have a temple. And so even if we wanted to perform the Pesach offering, we couldn't do it because again, there are various kinds of rules that involve that something that's on a sacrificial level going on. Torah achat yeh la'ezrach, the same law shall be to a citizen, in other words, a born Jew, a born Israelite, v'lager hagar b'tochachem, and to a ger and to a convert who resides amongst you or amongst them. Right? It's interesting, right? So it's saying something very fundamental regarding someone who chooses to become a member of the Israelites, that they are to be given all the same privileges, etc. And that would be, for the most part, like 99.9%. Torah achat, so one law, etc. And this is from the Mechilta, lehashvot ger leezrach, and that is to put on the same level, right, to equalize a person who converts to someone who's a born Jew, af l'sha'ar mitzvot sheba Torah, even to all the other mitzvahs that are in the Torah. That they are, so we can see mitzvot as obligations, or we can see mitzvot as privileges. So that there are some places. So, for example, in the ritual where a person would come to the temple and would make the statement Arami Oved Avi, right when they brought the Bikurim, they would say, my father, my ancestor was a wandering Aramean, if you want to translate it that way. But remember, a person who converted to Judaism or be converted to becoming an Israelite, a member of the Israelite people, cannot really say that because his father, his ancestor, was not this person. So there's a debate as to whether or not that particular element of the ritual is something that someone who isn't born an Israelite can actually perform. But really and truly, other than that, they are. Yes, Judith.
Well, what about each person is required to see himself as being personally brought forth from Egypt?
Yes, correct. So that isn't necessarily a declaration. That is more something, since you and I were not personally brought out of Egypt, to say we should see ourselves is not pushing the limit. Anyone can see themselves. It's something in a way it's a consideration, but it isn't a declaration. In other words, saying out loud, "You brought me out of Egypt," when God did, or you brought my ancestors out of Egypt, when God didn't bring your ancestors out of Egypt, that is a problem. But to say, look at yourself as if you personally were brought out of Egypt, that honestly, I think that one of the reasons for doing it, and perhaps it's the main reason, is to recognize that we have a special obligation to God in terms of loyalty. And the tradition is very aware of that. That part of the reason why Jewish people and the Israelites are to perform mitzvot is that they have a very special obligation of appreciation to God for having brought their ancestors out of Egypt. And that's why you should see yourself as personally being brought out of Egypt. Going on. So this, you can see we're onto the Shvi'i portion. We're almost done with Parshat Bo. And the following section includes parts that are included in the Shema, right? Not in the Shema itself, but in the Tefillin.
Okay.
Yes,
I had my hand up, so I just want to
of course.
follow up on because my question. I had two questions. One of them was
Okay.
similar
All
to
right.
what Judith said.
Yes.
So a comfort is supposed to look at themselves as a descendant of the patriarchs and matriarchs, right?
Correct. Right.
So that's why it seems like it would make sense that they would completely accept all of the activities of the past
Mhm.
as having happened to their ancestors because their ancestors now are considered to be, part of the people. A and B, I can't help thinking about this, especially in light of you're talking about the mitzvah of circumcision.
Mhm.
I know women are encouraged to obey as many mitzvot as they can, but that's obviously one they can't do. And I was wondering if it's less, and I know there's a difference between that time and this time, but there's no difference in encouraging or allowing or committing the act of conversion for women.
Absolutely. So I think that if I'm not mistaken, because women do not have a foreskin, they are seen as already circumcised. It's very specific about saying circumcise the males. Okay.
Yeah.
So women have, I realize again, you mentioned we look at things differently, but women, the role that women played, at least within the culture that we're seeing here, was extremely significant. And certainly, according to tradition, women were also obligated, right, to observe every single negative commandment, every single one. And the only mitzvot that women were excused from performing are positive time-bound commandments. And the reason for that, which you may already know, is that taking care of children was so important, making sure that that you made your children the priority, that they were excused from those commandments. Now, I know that there's different schools of thought that say, well, there's a school of thought that says, well, since they are excused, they shouldn't do it. But I think there's also a legitimate, within the tradition, a legitimate opinion that says it's simply that they're excused so that if they can't do it, if they have to take care of the children, they need to do that. But if they don't have children, or if they don't have to take care of the children and they want to perform the mitzvah, they're free to do it. To go a little bit
Free,
deeper,
but not obligated.
not obligated. Correct, correct, correct. So it's not stopping them from doing it. It's simply saying that when it comes to raising children and the attention that children require in order to raise them properly is overdoes time-bound positive commandments. Obviously, if it's not time-bound, you can take care of your child and then take care of the mitzvah, right? But it's clearly putting a high priority on that. And, you can draw your own conclusions as to, how thoughtful the whole practice of mitzvot is or not. It's depends on, I guess, your point of view.
But
Um,
what about the experiences of our ancestors being part of everybody's experience?
can you clarify the question?
Yeah, like along the lines of what Judith said, um, that since, once you convert, your ancestors then become the patriarchs and matriarchs. So all of the experiences of the relatives, including the wandering Arameans, would
Mhm.
be part of the experience of the convert as well.
Okay, so I think there's a distinction that's to be made, all right? One is that you are a spiritual descendant. All right. You're not a blood descendant, but as a spiritual descendant, that plays an incredibly important part, but not to the degree that you can make a statement that your ancestor had that experience. Your ancestor did not have that experience. You have chosen to make Abraham and Sarah your spiritual ancestors. And so that's why I'm saying, as I remember, right, it's a debate. Whether or not, in fact, the Talmud resolves that issue, I'm not sure. So the point is that the issue that you're raising is a legitimate issue, but there's obviously some shading involved in trying to understand that issue. So you can't totally change what is there. On the other hand, spiritually, you can decide where you are. And by the way, one of the things that we see here is that if whether or not he's a Jewish, an Israelite or not, if he's an Israelite who abandons the spiritual traditions of his ancestors, okay, then he's not going to have the privileges of someone who does accept it. So, it goes back to something else that I just realized relatively recently in reciting Shema Yisrael, that we're actually addressing Jacob. And we're saying that Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai, who's our God, meaning ours, including Jacob's, right? And understanding Elohim in the sense of one who has a right to command, who we accept as our divine commander. In other words, who's basically giving us mitzvot. The word Elohim is directly connected to performance of mitzvot. And we're saying to Jacob that just as he accepted God as his divine commander, we do as well. And Adonai Echad means one and the same. In other words, that when you say the Shema, at least according to this interpretation, we are trying to bind ourselves spiritually in a way that's not broken to that ancient ancestor Jacob. And in some ways, we see some support of this particular idea here in terms of what we practice and what we try to continue. And there's a balance. There's no doubt about it. The circumstances that Jacob lived in were different from the circumstances that we live in. And that's why we have the oral law. I mean, this is taken very seriously. It isn't just a matter of nice things. It's a matter of having a very deep connection, a very deep spiritual connection to our Creator. So it's all intertwined and makes a lot more sense if you understand, what's involved or try to understand what's involved in believing in a divine Creator. But believing in a divine Creator is only one step. The second step is to say, Adonai hu ha-Elohim, right? It's saying two things. We're saying Adonai, this concept of a transcendent divine creator, and Elohim is saying the part where we accept the idea of being commanded. So I hope I'm answering, at least to some extent, or clarifying some of the issues you're raising here. They're good issues, obviously. They're
I mean,
legitimate.
I would think at the very least that the Seder would be awkward if people are taking turns reading some of the text and here comes the convert and he's, not kind of excluded from this big part of the narrative.
Well, that's only just one thing. And if we're talking about practicalities now, all right, he's not this the context of that statement was when this person came to the temple and brought their bikurim, and as they gave their bikurim, they said it. That's not the context here. All right. And on the other hand, there's nothing wrong, I think, with being educated and understanding that it doesn't have to all just fit what I'd like it to fit. Part of loving God is accepting things that are problematic or difficult, etc., etc. And this is not a big thing. I mean, the Torah is saying very clearly that to treat a convert the way you treat a Israelite, and that just as Israelites are obligated, converts are also obligated. And you can see obligations, as I said, either as something negative or you can see it as a privilege, that being obligated places a certain level of dignity to who you are and importance. If you're obligated, you're important enough to be obligated. So there are various different things, and it's a question of trying to understand and to look at life in a little bit of a different way than we do modern in the modern world. I think we all have agreed that to some extent there's a very self-centered kind of way in which modern people tend to look at the world, right? And there's a wonderful statement I remember that said a person should carry a different two notes, one in each pocket. In one pocket, he should have a note that says, you're created in the divine image. And in the other pocket, he should have a note that says, the worm was created before you were. So in other words, it's having a balance, recognizing that we're important enough to count and to say that what we do has significance, and on the other hand, not to see ourselves as God. How do you manage that? So I'm happy to take anything else for the record if you'd like before I stop the lesson. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and we'll pick this up with chapter 13. Okay, I'm assuming
We
nothing
still
more.
have a couple of lines from this.
We do
Yeah,
from the
maybe a new
text.
chapter. You're
Okay, I'll
right.
take a look. All right, sorry. Let me make sure I.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
thank you. Yes, yes, yes. It's thank you, Leah. Let's do it. Right.
one Rashi and two
Okay,
lines.
let's see where the Rashi is. Okay, right. So we did do this Rashi here, okay, which says that it is to put a convert on the same level as a
Yeah.
as a
Okay.
Born Israelite. We did that Rashi, but let's go on with the text. Thank you, thank you. So here we go. Vaya'asu kol bnei Israel, and the entire children of Israel did kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, ve'et Aaron and Aaron, kain asu, they indeed do this. So again, thinking from a literary point of view, why this statement is made is to suggest that there may have been other circumstances where they didn't and they refused. But in this particular case, we can say that they were willing to take upon themselves all the obligations, etc., some of which we have described and discussed, whether they were flattering or not so flattering or however you want to put it, but they were willing to accept it. And so this is saying something, you know, I believe, very complimentary about how the Jewish people reacted to these commandments. Vahi, it's a new paragraph, right? Vahi be'etzem hayom hazeh, and it was on this very self same day, Hotzi Hashem ibnei Israel, the Lord took out the children of Israel me'eretz Mitzrayim, from the land of Egypt, al tzivotam, according to their ranks, by their ranks. And Lauren, thank you so much for bringing that to my attention, that we needed to finish up the next couple of verses so we could get to the beginning of chapter 13. So I'll stop the share once more. All right. Any comments for the record before we move on? Okay. All right.